The Great Depression wasn't America's first. It was just the one they let you remember. In 1893, 500 banks failed. Unemployment hit 43% in Michigan. The Treasury ran out of gold. And Congress, having watched all of it happen, proposed the exact reform that would have prevented it, debated it, and walked away. 20 years later, the same system collapsed again. That time, it was called the Great Depression. That time, the world paid attention. This is the story of the first one. Think of a contractor who keeps building additions onto a house, each new wing financed by a loan against the last one. The house looks extraordinary from the street. What visitors can't see is that the foundation is mortgaged 4 times over, and the contractor is already drawing plans for the next addition. That was the American economy in the decades following the Civil War. Between 1878 and 1969, over 100,000 miles of new railroad track were laid across the continent. Towns appeared overnight along rail lines. Fortunes were made in silver mining, steel, and land speculation at a pace that seemed to confirm every optimistic story Americans told themselves. Mark Twain called it the Gilded Age, deliberately, with irony, because beneath the gold surface, the foundation was compromised. The railroads were the backbone of the expansion and its most dangerous liability. Companies had borrowed enormous sums to fund growth into territory that couldn't yet support it. The debt was visible to anyone reading the balance sheets, but the Gilded Age ran on momentum, and momentum doesn't stop easily. Neither does leverage that has been profitable long enough to feel permanent. What finally stopped it wasn't a single bad decision. It was a policy, written in Washington, lobbied into existence by specific interests that began mechanically draining the one thing the entire system depended on: gold. In 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. On its surface, a political compromise between Eastern financial interests and Western silver mining states. In practice, a government-mandated wealth transfer dressed as monetary policy. The mechanics were simple and destructive. The Treasury had to purchase 4.5 million ounces of silver every month, paid for with newly issued Treasury notes redeemable for gold at a fixed ratio of 16:1, regardless of what the market said. Imagine a bank legally required to exchange monopoly money for real dollars at a fixed rate, no matter how much monopoly money gets printed. Now imagine the printers are a well-organized industry with significant lobbying power in Washington. The bank keeps buying, the printers keep printing, the real dollars keep leaving the vault. That is what Congress built. Silver miners flooded the market with new production. The Treasury kept buying. American investors and foreign bondholders redeemed their silver-backed notes for gold because gold was real and silver was increasingly not. The reserves hemorrhaged, $190 million in 1890, below $100 million, the legal floor, by April 1893. That threshold wasn't just a number, it was a psychological dam built into the structure of the financial system. When the gold reserves crossed it, the dam broke. The silver mining industry had gotten what it lobbied for. The cost was distributed across the entire economy. The benefit was concentrated in a specific industry whose representatives had written the relevant senators at the relevant moment. Nobody was ever asked to explain it in those terms. The first crack appeared on February 20th, 1893, 12 days before Grover Cleveland's second inauguration. The Philadelphia and Reading Railroad collapsed into receivership. Overextended, over-leveraged, the first domino. The warning went unheeded. On May 4th, the National Cordage Company, one of the most actively traded stocks on Wall Street, collapsed overnight. The next morning, May 5th, the Dow dropped 24% in a single session. They called it Industrial Black Friday. What followed was not a correction, it was a cascade. Bank runs spread across the South and West with the speed of rumor and the permanence of arithmetic. Over the course of 1893, 158 national banks failed, along with 172 state banks, 177 private banks, 13 savings banks, and 13 loan and trust companies. more than 500 institutions holding the savings of depositors who had done nothing wrong except trust a system with no mechanism to protect them. The railroad empires fell in sequence: Northern Pacific, Union Pacific, Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. In the first year alone, more than 150 railroad companies, controlling approximately 30,000 miles of track, went bankrupt by the time the collapse ran its course. 1/3 of all railroad mileage in the United States had passed through bankruptcy. A London correspondent observed at the time that Americans were a people of magnificent achievements and equally magnificent fiascos. He was watching from a safe distance. The people absorbing the fiasco were not. National unemployment estimates for 1893 ranged from 17 to 19%. State-level figures, reported rather than census-confirmed, describe something close to regional collapse. 25% in Pennsylvania, 35% in New York, 43% in Michigan. In parts of Ohio, half of all industrial workers had no jobs. These were not the chronically poor. These were families who had built their lives on the assumption that Gilded Age expansion was permanent. Workers in steady employment. Families buying homes. People who put their savings in a local bank because that was what responsible people did. The bank closed. The savings were gone. The mortgage payment was still due. In Detroit, Mayor Hazen Pingree converted vacant city lots into community gardens, the Potato Patch Plan, so that unemployed families could at least eat. When a city government's most innovative response to an economic crisis is teaching factory workers to grow potatoes on empty lots, the scale of the failure above them requires no elaboration. By July 1893, 45,000 Coloradans were out of work. Unemployment remained above 10% for the better part of 5 years. Hundreds of thousands of families lost savings they would never recover and a foothold in the middle class that the next generation would have to rebuild from nothing. The financial record names the institutions that failed. It names the railroads and the banks and the policies. It does not name the depositors. It rarely does. Grover Cleveland believed in the gold standard, limited government, and the virtue of executive restraint. He had been warned the crisis was coming. He had reasonable ideas about its cause. And for months, while banks collapsed and unemployment climbed toward numbers not seen again until the 1930s, he governed as though restraint were its own solution. When Congress adjourned in June 1893, Cleveland was keeping a secret that had nothing to do with monetary policy. He had been diagnosed with a cancerous growth in his mouth. The surgery required would be extensive, and Cleveland, watching markets react to every piece of news with the volatility of a system already near the edge, made a calculation. The public could not know. He arranged for the operation to be performed aboard a friend's yacht on the East River. A surgical team removed a large portion of his upper jaw. Cleveland appeared in public shortly afterward wearing a prosthetic that concealed the extent of the surgery. The American public didn't learn what had happened until 1917, when one of the participating surgeons published his account 24 years after the fact. The President of the United States of America underwent secret cancer surgery while the national economy was in freefall. He called Congress back into special session on August 8th. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act was repealed in October. The acute panic eased. The Depression continued. The repeal treated the immediate cause and left the structural problem completely intact. A banking system with no central authority, no lender of last resort, no circuit breaker capable of stopping a panic once it had momentum. The fuse had been removed. The house was still mortgaged 4 times over. By February 1895, the Treasury's gold reserves had fallen to approximately $42 million. The legal floor was $100 million. The United States government was not metaphorically insolvent, it was functionally insolvent, days away from being unable to meet its obligations. On February 5th, J.P. Morgan took the train from New York to Washington without an appointment. When he was received by Cleveland, he delivered an assessment that was, depending on your perspective, either a warning or a demonstration of leverage. There was a $10 million draft outstanding against the Treasury. If it was presented for payment and the Treasury couldn't meet it, Morgan told the president, it would be all over before 3 o'clock that afternoon. 3 days later, the Morgan-Belmont Agreement was signed. Morgan and August Belmont, the American representative of the Rothschild banking family, arranged for approximately $65 million in gold to be delivered to the Treasury in exchange for government bonds. The gold standard was preserved. The government did not default. Morgan resold the bonds at a profit. The precise figure has been disputed across sources and has never been definitively confirmed. What is not disputed is the structure. The wealthiest private banker in America rescued the United States Treasury, accepted government bonds as payment, and sold them at a gain, legally with the full cooperation of the executive branch, because there was no public alternative. That last part is where the story actually lives. There was no central bank, no Federal Reserve, no institutional mechanism outside the private banking system capable of performing the function Morgan performed that February. The United States government, in a crisis of its own policies making, had no instrument of rescue except the profit motive of one private citizen. Morgan wasn't a villain in the legal sense. He was a rational actor in a system with no circuit breaker. A system built, maintained, and defended by the same institutions that expressed outrage at the result. The outrage was real. So was the architecture that made him necessary. While Morgan negotiated in private, something was happening in the country that Washington wasn't taking seriously. In March 1894, Ohio businessman named Jacob Coxey gathered approximately 100 unemployed men in Massillon and began walking east. His demand was straightforward. The federal government should respond to mass unemployment by funding public works, roads, infrastructure, jobs, financed through government bonds. It required Washington to accept responsibility for conditions it had helped create. It was a radical idea in 1894. As Coxey's army moved east, it grew. By May 1st, the first organized protest march on Washington in American history, roughly 500 men stood on the Capitol steps with a petition and a proposal. The government's response was immediate and specific. Coxey and his leaders were arrested. Their charge, walking on the Capitol grass. Not incitement, not disorder, walking on the grass. Coxey later asked whether the preservation of the Capitol lawn was of greater importance than saving thousands from starvation. The question received no official answer. 40 years later, the federal government implemented virtually the same proposal as the centerpiece of the New Deal. The idea that got Coxey arrested became the policy that defined an era. On May 1, 1944, exactly 50 years after his arrest, Jacob Coxey was invited back to the Capitol steps and asked to read his original petition aloud. He was 90 years old. The government that had arrested him for delivering it had spent the previous decade governing by it. George Pullman had built a company town outside Chicago where his workers lived, shopped, and paid rent, all to him. When the Depression hit, he cut wages by up to 25%. He did not cut rents. The arithmetic was not complicated. A worker earning less, paying the same rent, buying necessities at the same prices in company stores was not experiencing hardship in the ordinary sense. He was experiencing a trap, a system designed so that the cost of the depression flowed to the worker and the revenue stability flowed to the owner. On May 11, 1894, the workers struck. Eugene Debs organized a national boycott of Pullman cars through his American Railway Union beginning June 26th. Within days, rail traffic across the country was paralyzed. Cleveland sent federal troops over the explicit objection of Illinois Governor Altgeld, who understood that federal soldiers were being deployed not to restore order, but to restore Pullman's balance sheet. Violence followed. Workers were killed. Debs was arrested. The strike was broken by August 2nd. Clarence Darrow was a railroad lawyer at the time. He watched what happened: the troops, the arrests, the killed workers, the broken union, and quit. He took Debs's defense. It launched one of the most consequential legal careers in American history, because one man looked at the documented record and found he could no longer stay on the side that had produced it. A federal commission later found Pullman's paternalism partly to blame, described his company as un-American, and condemned his refusal to negotiate. The report was thorough. It changed nothing for the workers who had already lost. Pullman died in 1897. His family buried him in a lead-lined coffin encased in concrete, reinforced with steel rails. The fear was that his former workers would dig him up. Even in death, the hatred his decisions had generated required an architectural solution. On June 28, 1894, while federal troops were actively deployed to crush the Pullman strike, President Cleveland signed legislation creating Labor Day as a national holiday. A federal holiday honoring the American worker, signed by the president simultaneously sending soldiers to break the largest labor action in the country's history. Labor Day is the only federal holiday created during an active federal crackdown on the movement it was designed to honor. That detail doesn't come up at the barbecues, but the dates are in the congressional record, and they are not ambiguous. In 1900, L. Frank Baum published The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. In 1964, historian Henry Littlefield argued in the American Quarterly that the book was also a monetary allegory of the 1890s Depression, encoded in a fairy tale. Dorothy is the everyday American. The Scarecrow is the farmer. The Tin Woodman is the industrial worker stripped of humanity by industrial capitalism. The Cowardly Lion is widely read as William Jennings Bryan: passionate rhetoric, insufficient follow-through. Together, they marched down the yellow brick road, the gold standard, toward the Emerald City, Washington, the city of money and political power, to seek help from a wizard who turns out to be a fraud behind a curtain. In the original book, Dorothy's slippers weren't ruby, they were silver. The solution, encoded in the object that had the power all along, was silver. Even the name Oz has been read as an abbreviation for ounces, the unit in which gold and silver are measured. Whether Baum intended any of this is genuinely disputed. Littlefield later softened his own claims. No definitive statement of intent survives. But here is what requires no interpretation. A man who lived through the Depression of the 1890s wrote a story about ordinary people marching toward a seat of power to ask for help, only to find that the power was an illusion and the help was never coming. It became the most beloved children's story in American history. The crisis was real enough that someone encoded it in a fairy tale. The fairy tale outlasted the memory of the crisis by a century, which tells you something about which version of events the culture found easier to keep. The 1894 midterms delivered a verdict on the Democratic Party that was, by any historical measure, catastrophic. Cleveland's party lost 110 seats in the House, one of the largest congressional swings in American history. Democrats would not control any branch of the federal government until 1910. Out of that wreckage came William Jennings Bryan, 36 years old, former congressman from Nebraska. At the 1896 Democratic Convention in Chicago, he delivered what remains one of the most studied speeches in American political history, giving language to an economic grievance that millions had been living but couldn't articulate. "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." The convention erupted. Bryan won the nomination. In the general election, he faced William McKinley, whose campaign was backed by a war chest assembled with significant assistance from the financial community, men who understood precisely what was at stake and funded the side most likely to preserve the system that had made them wealthy. McKinley won. The gold standard held. The Gold Standard Act passed in 1900. The people who caused the panic backed the candidate who preserved the conditions that caused it. The candidate who spoke for the people who absorbed the cost lost. The system was ratified by democratic process, financed by the interests it was built to protect. That is not allegation. It is the documented structure of the 1896 election. After the panic, the American Bankers Association and the Secretary of the Treasury proposed legislation to address the structural cause. A banking system with no central authority, no lender of last resort, no mechanism to contain a panic before it became a collapse. They drafted a framework. Congress held hearings. Witnesses testified. The problem was documented with precision. Then Congress did nothing. Not deferred, nothing. The hearings closed, the testimony was filed, Washington returned to other business. The Federal Reserve was established in 1913, 20 years later, after a separate crisis in 1907 made inaction politically untenable. Had it existed in 1893, the panic almost certainly doesn't reach full collapse. The gold drain is managed, the bank runs are contained, the cascade stops. Morgan never gets his moment in the Oval Office. Coxey marches to a Washington that has other tools. The Depression lifted in 1897, 4 years after it began. Unemployment above 10% for half a decade. Hundreds of thousands of families ruined. The political map redrawn, and the structural cause, the absence of any public mechanism to do what Morgan had done for profit, left exactly as it was. In 1929, the same architecture produced the same result. Worse, unemployment hit 25% nationally. The breadlines were long enough to photograph, the suffering was impossible to contain, and the world paid attention. It took the New Deal, public works, government bonds, federal job programs to begin the recovery. The same proposal Coxey had carried to Washington in 1894, the one that got him arrested for walking on the grass. A crisis you don't remember is a crisis you're bound to repeat. America proved that in 1929, but the proof had already been written in 1893 in bank failures and foreclosures, a secret surgery on a yacht, a private banker's profit, a federal holiday signed during a crackdown, and a fairy tale about silver slippers and a yellow brick road leading to a wizard who was never really there. The Panic of 1893 is not a footnote. It is the first draft. History chose to remember the revision. That doesn't make the original less true. It just makes it more dangerous.